All right, everybody. Welcome to the Manchester by the Sea Museum's Speaker Series. I am Director Matthew Swindell and very pleased to welcome you here tonight. This is the American semi-quincentennial this year, America 250, and we're certainly rolling out the stops when it comes to revolutionary interpretation here in Manchester. We do have some artifacts of our own here at the museum, as certainly we will be getting a wider scope of objects from Historic New England's collection with Dr. Erica Lome. And I would also like to say that coming up, our Shark's Mouth Soiree is scheduled for June 25th this year, in which the featured talk will be yours truly, talking on Manchester in the Revolution. And we will also then, the next week, have our opening reception for the reinvigorated Manchester, the Revolution, and the War at Sea exhibit, focusing on historical displays of Manchester and the Revolution, a recreation of the Forster flag, and contemporary art interpreting the Revolution. And that exhibit will go from July 2nd until September 19th this summer. And we also, I will say, are opening summer hours on Sundays this summer as well, from June 14th through September 13th. So if you wanted an extra day to come to the museum, we are accommodating you this summer. So at the museum, I said that we have some objects. I'll say that if you've been to the museum lately, you might have seen our revolutionary artifacts display. We have some archival items, say payroll, militia orders. We have a very interesting little tap bottle said to be used by a woman named Phoebe McDonald to feed gruel to revolutionary soldiers. We have a canteen, which came from a family in which there's a DL there's a David Lee who was the son of a revolutionary soldier who had a canteen. And then we have a piece of the Washington elm in Cambridge, which is a rather legendary tree, which I believe has been rather discredited, but it was long believed to be the tree in which Washington took command of his army in 1775 during the siege of Boston and Cambridge. So we certainly have a few objects ourselves, but the subject tonight really does hit at the larger scope of Revolutionary War items that have come down to us in the present day. Going into Historic New England's collection, Dr. Erica Lome has just presented an exhibit opened at the Eustace House in Milton, featuring objects from the American Revolution embedded with memories and mythologies. I am now very pleased to introduce Collections Curator of Historic New England, Dr. Erica Lome.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you Matthew and Allison and everyone at the museum who invited me. And thank you all for coming out on this beautiful evening to hear me talk about the work I've been doing for the last several years, putting this exhibition together, Myth and Memory, Stories of the American Revolution, which began, as most museums, including Manchester by the Sea Museum, we have to mark the occasion of our semi-quincentennial anniversary of the American Revolution, a word that I practiced, so I could say. And of course, every museum, every historic institution, every civic building is doing some kind of display for 250. And so I thought, well, what does Historic New England have to say? What can we do that's different, unique, exciting? And then it really goes back to the collection. We have so many interesting stories that come with our objects, and stories and the storytelling is really what we pride ourselves on. So Myth and Memory really comes from looking at our collection and then going through the object files and sifting through the donor letters and some of the stories that these donor letters conveyed. A lot of it was family lore. A lot of it was memories passed down generation to generation, and over time, those memories become perhaps embellished. Perhaps they take on the quality of myth. In other cases, we have objects that are very well documented, but their meanings have changed over time as they've gone through the hands of witnesses to collectors and antiquarians and then in museums, and how an institution like Historic New England, which is very much embedded in the sort of colonial revival and the myth-making itself, how we have altered these objects by bringing them into a museum and putting them on display. And then you'll also find some new stories, some new perspectives on familiar tales. So essentially my goal with the show is kind of to myth bust our collection. And as you'll see, I'm going to share some really interesting highlights from the collection, some of the stories and the process that I went through to either verify, debunk, challenge, confirm, and in some cases there are still questions to be asked, mysteries to solve, but I thought all of that made for a really good exhibition, and I think you'll agree. So this is my plug. The Myth and Memory is open at the Eustis Estate in Milton, Massachusetts, which is like a world away from here, even though we are technically in the same state. I understand we're right near the border of Rhode Island, so it's quite a schlep, but if you can make it there, the exhibition closes in November, you have plenty of time. So it really rewards coming to see in person. And as Matthew was saying, we are certainly not the only institution to have these types of objects very much laden with the memories and mythologies of their owners and families and collectors. We have, like I said, you have the sort of Molly Pitcher story of this woman who, had this bottle. You have the Washington elm, which is the donor letter claims it came at a later date than it actually existed. You have, objects that have been not sort of claimed over time by descendants of family members to put their names on it. So very similar objects, very similar collections to ours. And so this is certainly a phenomenon that you will see across New England in particular, because we are loath to throw anything away. So the galleries are split into 4 themes: resistance, loyalty, liberty, and memory. And in this first gallery, resistance, I really wanted to examine the many ways that New England colonists made their voices heard in the protest against British Parliament, whether that meant boycotting, protesting, fighting, putting pen to paper, speaking out, and the objects that either were associated with these moments of resistance or were made afterwards in commemoration for those who resisted. And perhaps their most iconic object in the collection is this humble pewter teapot and little cup. And as you can see, these are not in the best shape. The base of the teapot is a little busted, the handle's been replaced, the teacup is full of nicks and marks. But by its history, both of these objects belong to Crispus Attucks, who was the first casualty of the Boston Massacre. Oh, I can see a name you all know, and I'll tell you why you know that name. So he was a black man who was formerly enslaved, or perhaps even still enslaved at the time of his death. The record really is unclear about that. But he was a sailor. He was working in Boston during the British occupation of the city. And in 1770, there was a clash between colonists and a group of British soldiers, and it escalated into gunfire. And Crispus Attucks was the first to die. He was shot by musket fire. And in many ways, people claim him as the first casualty of the American Revolution because of his death at the Boston Massacre. Immediately after this event, even immediately after he died, his second life began. Immediately he is memorialized in this engraving by Paul Revere, which is used essentially as propaganda to stir up support for the revolutionary cause. John Adams first hails him as a hero of the night, and then his opinion turns when he is put in charge of the defense of the British soldiers, and Crispus Attucks is suddenly an instigator. Either way, his name starts to be used and invoked to sort of, on either side to further agendas. And, he might have otherwise receded, into becoming a footnote of this story, but in the 1850s, his name is revived, his memory is revived. And in Boston in the 1850s, the abolition movement is really picking up steam. And black Bostonians, black abolitionists are really looking for heroes, figures that they can prop up as sort of, we have always been here, we've always been fighting for liberty, and there is no better symbol than Crispus Attucks. William Cooper Nell, who is the gentleman on the left, he is sort of the leader of this effort to get Crispus Attucks Day to become a holiday in Boston, to get a commemorative sculpture made. So he's going, he's becoming a patriot before our very eyes, a hero of the Revolution. And it's around this time that the teapot and teacup come into existence. And they are offered to William Nell by the Brown family of Framingham. The Brown family were his enslavers back in the 18th century. And we know this because there was a runaway ad in 1750. And this is where the record is unclear about whether he was actually returned to the Brown family. But they claim that this teapot and teacup belonged to Crispus Attucks, and they want to essentially let the abolitionists borrow it to have as part of their larger, display and exhibition of relics of the American Revolution. So I'm sort of a few different minds for this. Like I said, this is a very dinged up pewter teapot. On one hand, New Englanders never throw anything away. So there's perhaps some cause to believe that a genteel New England family would hold on to these pewter household items, even if they belonged to someone who was no longer, in their household. On the other hand, it's awfully convenient that just in the moment that Crispus Attucks' name is becoming known again, and the Brown family, who have very political ambitions and who want to associate themselves with the abolition cause, have stepped forward to offer these tokens, maybe as a bit of a reputation bolster. Whether or not they actually belong to Crispus Attucks kind of did not matter. They were imbued with this sort of sacred power of their association with him. And they went on display, they went on exhibition, the Bostonian Society had them, and they actually were at the Bostonian Society for, just a small period of time. They were donated by the family in 1918. And the woman who donated them, she says that these wouldn't be of any interest to you if not for their association with Crispus Attucks. That's the historic value of these objects. And when they came to historic New England, it's a little funny. If you know anything about us, our founder, William Sumner Appleton, he was sort of obsessed with the everyday life of New Englanders. So his letter to his donor is very much like, actually, I love pewter objects. This is great. I'll add it to the collection. But then, very much since it's been in our collection since 1918, it has been perhaps the most cherished possession in our collection. It's on the cover of the book, Cherished Possessions. So it has sort of taken on a second and third life. And like I said, the mythology around Crispus Attucks is very much associated with these material objects because it's all we have of him that survives. Similarly, another fabulous survival in our collection is this journal that belonged to Colonel Samuel Pierce, and he built, he lived in our Pierce house in Dorchester, Massachusetts, which is one of the oldest houses in Massachusetts. And he was a farmer, and this was his farm diary. And in it, he kept meticulous accounts of harvests, of house raisings, of the everyday goings-on of his community and family. He also, in red, you'll see, notated the revolutionary things happening in his backyard practically. He writes down the Boston Tea Party. He writes down the siege of, gunfire is happening in his city. He is deployed. He's part of the fortification of Dorchester Heights. It's this terrific object for just showing how, not mundane, but just how everyday this experience of war was for the people who were living through it, who still had to make a living, who still had to farm their fields, who still had to go make trade. So this is all kind of happening in the backdrop, and it's never been exhibited before, but we just had it restored and digitized for the first time. So if you go to our web app through the Eustis Estate website, you'll find our online exhibition and you can flip through it. It's a terrific survival. And then we wandered down the hall into loyalty. And in loyalty, I really wanted to challenge and dismantle this idea of the loyalists as these sort of villains of the story. It's not black and white. If you were a New Englander in the late 18th century, you were probably a little scared of the prospect of a civil war. You did not want to necessarily go to war against the greatest army in the world. And that was really what was not inevitable, but that was where we were headed. And there were a lot of people who made decisions, very personal decisions, very intimate decisions about where they stood. And those decisions had consequences. And I explored different consequences in this show and how this idea and question of loyalty played out not just on the battlefield, but inside the home, in people's lives and in communities. And I think there's no better story to illustrate that than with our Otises. Have any of you been to Otis House in Boston? Beautiful, okay. It's a beautiful old bullfinch house. The Otis family, very well known. They were prominent politicians. They were also staunch revolutionaries. You might have heard, of course, of Mercy Otis Warren, who was a playwright and poet, very outspoken proponent of revolution. And many, many brothers in that family, two of them we'll talk about today, Samuel Otis and James Otis. And like I said, this was a very political family, but they married into merchant wealth. And in the case of Samuel Otis and Elizabeth Otis, Gray Otis, Elizabeth Gray's father, Harrison Gray, was a very wealthy merchant, and a lot of wealthy merchants were ambivalent, if not outright hostile, to the idea of boycotting imported British goods. That was their livelihood, that was their trade. And so Harrison Gray was, branded as a loyalist, and he and his sons, all of Elizabeth's brothers, packed up and went to England in the 1770s. And I want you to just picture in your head what that must have been like, to wake up one day to find half your family gone, to find half your community gone almost overnight. And Elizabeth, in her letters to her father, is heartbroken. It feels like a death to her. She is grieving the loss of family and friends. She is very loyal to her husband, and by all accounts, they had a very happy marriage. But she is divided, and it comes, unfortunately, to a tragic end when she dies in 1779. And her husband, Samuel, has the unhappy task of writing to his father-in-law, Harrison Gray, to relay the news. And here's just an excerpt from a letter she's sending to her father. You can just see how heartbroken she is that, basically everyone I love has left me. And the letter that Harrison Gray sends to Samuel Otis upon hearing this news really sticks with me. And he says, the tenderness and affection you had for my dear child make you stand high in my estimation, notwithstanding we widely differ in our political principles. It's a very nuanced take here. The same really couldn't be said for another set of, another couple, James and Ruth Cunningham Otis. By all accounts, they had a very unhappy marriage. While James Otis was a staunch, patriot, Ruth was very much a loyalist, capital L loyalist. And it made for a bitterly divided household. One daughter marries a patriot, one daughter marries a loyalist, a son dies as a prisoner of war. And Ruth, although she does not leave behind any of her own letters, all that we know is pretty much carried secondhand. We know that there was, it came at quite a cost. John Adams, writes in his diary that he was at a party with James Otis and he's getting drunk and he's complaining, my wife's a good wife, but she's a Tory, she's a high Tory. Mercy Otis Warren is not very kind to her sister-in-law, calls her a weak, infatuated woman who has brought innumerable difficulties upon her own family. And there's gossip that letters that she's writing to her friend Hannah Winthrop. Hannah Winthrop says, oh, I encountered their son the other day, and the son said, I quote, Mama is a fine lady, but she would be much finer if she was a daughter of liberty. This is like third hand. Whether or not he said that cannot be claimed. But it just shows how it was quite well known that this was not a happy marriage and this was a very divided family on political lines. How it ends is that James Otis dies in 1783 of a lightning strike. He does not see America become an independent nation, but his wife does. We have another loyalist, who I call a reluctant loyalist. His name is Jonathan Sayward. Has any of you been to our Sayward Wheeler House in York, Maine? It's right on the river. Okay, we got one person back there. Good, I invite you all to come see it. So this house is a beautiful house, and it reflects Jonathan Sayward's advanced position in life. He was in middle age, he had already been through a war, several decades earlier. He'd been there, done that, he does not want to do it again. And he has amassed his fortune in trade, he has risen to prominent office locally and in state government. He is the representative of York to the Massachusetts legislature. And so he wants to avoid a civil war at all costs. And there is a vote in the 1760s. The legislature wants to send a circular letter to all the other colonial governments in America and basically say, join us, we're protesting Great Britain, but we can't do it alone, we need all the states to come together. And so they vote to send out this letter. The royal governor of Massachusetts gets wind of this and says, we're not doing that, rescind the letter. And so it's put to a vote. Who is going to send the letter and who's going to rescind the letter? Jonathan Sayward votes to rescind. And almost immediately after, Paul Revere, my favorite engraver, says that there is a place for these rescinders, a warm place, hell. The fallout of this decision is going to haunt poor Jonathan Sayward. He is almost immediately after punished, and this is a letter that he writes, and if you you don't have to read all of it, but to summarize, he is effectively ostracized by society, he is mobbed, he is stripped of his offices, his trade is imperiled, he unfortunately loses his wife, but that has nothing to do with this, it's just an unfortunate thing that also happens in 1775 for him. But he was writing this in December 1775, looking back on it, just a miserable year. And one can maybe sympathize with him. He says in his diary, this opposition to Parliament will undo us. He does not want to go to war with Britain. He thinks they will squash us like a bug. And he's also, I think, terrified of the Sons of Liberty. These are like a mob of unruly men in their 20s going around, tarring and feathering people, dragging them through town, making a mockery of them. I think he's terrified out of his mind, but unfortunately, you can't be neutral in this situation, and so he suffers the consequences. The consequences being placed under house arrest in his beautiful home in York, Maine. So let's have a little perspective here. And so then he writes to him, he says, I keep 200 pounds of gold and paper currency under my bed in case a mob comes to me in the middle of the night to drag me out of my house, which does not happen, but he's afraid of it. And so he is writing in his diary, and he records in 1777, I heard the clock every hour last night, little or no sleep. And when I first read this line, I thought, oh, he must be afraid again of the mob coming for him. But then I did a little bit more research. Turns out he had just learned about the death of his nephew, who was a patriot, who died in service of the revolution. Again, complicated. He's in mourning for a member of his family. That's why he stays awake. That's why he hears the strike of this clock, which we have in the gallery, and we've recorded the strike of the midday clock, so now it plays periodically in the exhibition. Inside Sayward Wheeler's household, we have at least 3 enslaved men, Cato, Prince, and Benito, and loyalty had a very different meaning for them. In Prince's case, he went to muster without Jonathan Sayward's consent so that he could be essentially eligible to enlist in the Continental Army. And Sayward writes this down, and a group of anonymous townspeople in York come together and purchase Prince's freedom, which he permits, of course. And Prince goes, fights for the revolutionary cause. He comes back as a veteran and marries a local woman, Dinah, who's enslaved at the nearby tavern. And he unfortunately does not live much longer than that. He dies of tuberculosis. And in Sayward's diary, he talks about how, he had been my servant, a slave. The new constitution made him free. And so he paid to cover the costs of Prince's burial. And lest you start to think, oh, he must have been a very benevolent slaveholder, which is an oxymoron. What I find so interesting is that the only times that Prince appears in his diaries is when money is involved. So again, we're thinking about economic exchanges of human lives here. What does the cost benefit of, letting this man, paying for his freedom? What is the, it's coming out of his own pocket to pay for his funeral. So he's thinking as a merchant in some ways still. Dinah petitions to receive her pension benefits as the widow of a veteran. And the whole town comes together to essentially petition the government and send in her application. And as you can see in the lower detailed image here, the only trace of Dinah that we have in the records is the X that she makes. That's her mark. So again, various names of loyalty. And in 1784, Jonathan Sayward writes a letter. He's in a very pensive mood. He has lived to see American independence. I'm all in wonder, he says. And in this letter to a friend we don't know, he's sort of looking back, and he is still quite pessimistic about this whole thing. And he says, I'm flattering myself that I may live to see the day when my bitterest persecutors may think, if not say it, it would have been happy for America if your sentiments and mine had been adopted and attended to. So very much kind of ends this chapter of his life with increased skepticism that independence can be sustained and last. I wanted to highlight this wonderful object in our gallery. Since this is a recent acquisition, we only brought it into the collection a couple of years ago, but it's such a phenomenal object. What you're looking at is a 18th century looking glass with a sort of Venetian style mirrored glass panels. Glass in the 18th century was one of the most expensive materials, and looking glasses were often the highest valued objects in a household inventory. So we're not looking at just a standard looking glass with a wooden frame. We're looking at a looking glass with a mirrored frame, glass on glass. It's insane. I'd never seen this kind of object before in New England, or even in American collections. I was immediately hooked, and then was even more drawn to the story that attended it. It had descended in one family, the Cogswell family, as remarkable as that is, since we own our Cogswell's Grand House in Essex. And the story goes that it was confiscated by from a British officer who was, evacuating Boston, and it was sold at auction on the Common, and the Cogswell family picked it up, and it has been in their house ever since. So and what even more remarkable is that the story came on a notarized affidavit, which I've never seen before, that someone's family lore basically being notarized. Does that mean it's true? It means that someone thought it was true enough that they had a witness swear to it. So I immediately wanted to investigate this object. And there are a few things that I'm going to tweak here. Is that there certainly were auctions, but they were for goods confiscated from loyalist estates. And they were held near the City Hall now, which was at the time sort of the police constable's house. And so there were auctions held, but they were for loyalist goods. So we immediately, I'm doubtful that this was a British officer, because the British were here for what they thought was going to be a very short engagement. We'll occupy the city, we'll quell the rebels, we'll go home. Why would you bring your insanely expensive looking glass for that mission? No, not even Thomas Gage would have brought that with him. So it could have only belonged to a loyalist, someone at the stature of, say, a Thomas Hutchinson, or someone really at the 1% of society, because as I said, this is an obscenely expensive object. And it shows you just essentially what the loyalists were leaving behind. They had to just leave everything and run when they were exiled. So this was probably a great loss to someone who had to abandon his estate. And a great gain for the Cogswell's family. And by the time it came to us, the mirror was in quite a state of disrepair. The panels had been falling off, and there had been numerous campaigns of restoration. We have this great picture of it hanging in the house, and it's just, it's above the little table with all the family photos. And it had fallen off the wall a couple of times, and you could really see that. And it took about a year of conservation in our lab, and Lydia, our fellow, made it her life's work. She says she's now the foremost expert on these kinds of mirrors. No one else is working on them. But in the restoration, the conservation process really raised some interesting questions about this mirror. We found that you would expect to see tin mercury amalgam, which is what most 18th century mirrors had to create that reflective surface. But there was no more mercury. At some point it had probably all pulled out, and sometime in the 19th century it was resilvered, a process developed after 1835. We suspected that the lower pane of glass wasn't original, the glass was somewhat off. We had the lead tested, we had the wood tested, we had everything tested. And originally I thought, well, this must be an English mirror in the Venetian style. But this became a sort of expedition of bringing in experts from all over the world practically. And then we encountered a German curator who said, oh, well, the way the frame and the back is put together, it's lap joined and it's dowel joined, which are techniques you mostly see in continental European furniture and mirrors. So not English. And the wood that we tested was beechwood, which is more commonly seen in continental Europe. So that helped me narrow my focus. And now I'm sort of tentatively attributing it to this factory in Germany that were making very similar looking glasses from about 1690 all the way through the early 19th century. And so I'm very confident now in saying that most of the story is true, that this is an 18th century looking glass. It wasn't probably sold at auction, but the original owners, that still remains a mystery, and I'm hoping to one day get a small army of interns to track down. Because what's so interesting is that when the Loyalists moved to England after the war, they started essentially filing lawsuits saying, I want my stuff back. And so they had to create these itemized inventories of their household, which they sent overseas back to Massachusetts, to Boston. And so those claims for reimbursement are the way that we can help reconstruct what these Loyalist households had. And so in one of those court documents is an exact match for this looking glass. I have neither the time nor the stamina to do it, but if anyone wants to volunteer, maybe we can make that happen. We're going to move into the Liberty Gallery now. And liberty was an ideal and a call to action for these colonists. It wasn't just something that was fought for nationhood, but it was also a very personal choice. People were fighting for their own liberties in many cases. And an example of that is Cicero. We have recently recovered information about Cicero. He lived in one of our mid-coast Maine houses, Bowman House, which is right on the banks of the Kennebec River. And it was built by Jonathan Bowman. He was a relation of the Hancock family who had essentially been dispatched to Maine to sort of take care of their land interests up there. And his new wife, Mary Emerson, took their young enslaved boy, Cicero, with them. And Jonathan Bowman was himself a revolutionary. And what I find so interesting is that the rhetoric that a lot of these revolutionaries used to get people agitated was the threat of slavery. Britain is going to enslave us. They will oppress us. It's tyranny. We must not be slaves to Britain. That is the kind of rhetoric that is being spoken of in the taverns, in the churches, everywhere. And if you can imagine, Cicero's not too probably far from Jonathan Bowman, and he's hearing all this. And what do you think that effect has on a young man's mind? Well, in Cicero's case, he takes his opportunity and flees Bowman House in November 1775 and enlists in the Continental Army. And almost immediately after this happens, Jonathan Bowman places an ad in the paper, and he lists everything that Cicero was wearing the night he ran away. And so, in many cases, these runaway ads are the only form of knowledge we have about the material lives of the enslaved. And at the very least, we know the clothes they wore. And in Cicero's case, we could use this document to reconstruct and reimagine him the night he left. And so we used a mix of items from our own collection, the breeches and the stockings. We had good 18th century dupes for those. In the case of the jacket, he specifically cited that he wears a ratteen jacket. Ratteen is a sort of coarse wool. It is more often used in... I'll wait for you to turn it off. Thank you. Ratteen is often used in upholstery linens and floor coverings. It is not the kind of wool that you would wear typically on your body, except that it was appropriated to be used to clothe enslaved individuals. It was known as slave cloth. So it's a very particular kind of textile, and it really doesn't exist anymore, and there are very few survivals of it. So we worked with a weaver up in Maine to try to recreate it as best we could, and then to take that fabric and make it into a jacket to show him the night that he left. And so Cicero's journey is, he goes from Dresden, Maine, known as Hellborough at the time. He goes to Kittery, he joins up with a company there. That company goes down to Newburyport, he transfers to another company, and then transfers to a final company to go down to Cambridge. And we think he was trying to get ahead of the runaway ads, since they were published and reproduced throughout the East Coast, as most runaway ads were. We know all this because Jonathan Bowman sent a man to capture him. His name was Reuben Colburn. And Reuben Colburn kept sort of itemized list of his expenses so that he could be reimbursed at the end of his journey. And so these reimbursements included reimbursing the militia captains, the militia companies. The army essentially was paying to clothe and feed and arm Cicero, just like they did any other mustered man. And so if you're going to remove that vital source of labor from a company, you have to compensate the government for that loss. And so Reuben Colburn tracks Cicero to Cambridge and then apprehends him in December. Almost the day he arrives, practically, he's able to locate Cicero. Whether or not that means he had already been apprehended, we don't know. But the two of them go back to Maine, and they basically come back January 6, 1776. And so this one bill, this very cold clinical document, basically distills all the information we have about Cicero and his journey to, you know, an itemized receipt so that he can be compensated. And that's where the paper trail ends for Cicero. We don't know, we can't find him in the census, we can't find him in any sort of official documents, so we don't know what happened to him. He was 21 years old. He comes back to Bowman House and his fate is unknown to us for now. Another wonderful object in this gallery is a pulpit, beautifully carved pulpit that was installed in Brattle Street Church in Cambridge in 1772. It was commissioned by John Hancock. And Brattle Street Church was sort of the congregation to be at. It was where the Warrens and the Adamses and the Hancocks, it's where, you know, all of the names you know were congregants of that church. And the pulpit was one of the few places, especially for women, where you could get information about politics, where the current events were shared and information was disseminated, and ministers had a very important role in their communities. And if you know, there are some ministers in my show who try to, you know, have it both ways and say, we should accept the occupation of our city for the, you know, for public peace. They would be harassed out of their congregation. But Samuel Cooper, who's the minister of Brattle Street Church, he is very much a revolutionary, and he infuses his sermons with revolutionary sentiments. He says that freedom is not governed by human compact. Freedom is a God-given right to all people, which is, again, an ironic thing to say after I've just told you about Cicero. God-given to some people, but not all, it would seem. During the siege of Boston, Cooper had to flee his church, and the church was seized by the British and used as army barracks. Unfortunately, it was fired upon by the Americans, and this cannonball was lodged in the facade of the church and was there until about 1870. When Samuel Cooper came back after the siege, he rejoiced to find that the pulpit was not harmed at all. It was in perfect condition. And both the pulpit and the cannonball have come to us and are on display in our galleries, which I think is, and then he would continue to preach. He would talk about the French joining us. He would talk about surrender of various armies. So it became where you would go to get the news of the day. In our final gallery, Memory, we're talking about the wonderful impulse of New Englanders to preserve, collect, commemorate historic events, even as they were still happening. The war had moved to other arenas, but New Englanders were very much in the business of memorializing before the ink was dry. And so I talk about what kind of shape that took in many different objects. But one of the important stories we tell in this gallery belong to the Quincy family of Quincy, Massachusetts. Has anyone been to our Quincy house in Quincy, Massachusetts? Good, it's a beautiful house. Quincy family, very prominent family. Again, the Adamses, they're all intermarried. And one of the members of that family is Josiah Quincy Jr. He is a lawyer. He's a very gifted orator, very persuasive writer. And unlike, you know, his father or some of his family members, he was not perhaps the most fiery revolutionary. He really did think that we could find a way out of a civil war. We could talk our way out of it. We could find a peaceable and diplomatic solution. He was vehemently against the occupation of Boston. He says, why are there armed mercenaries terrorizing innocent people in our city? The sword should never be used as a tool to oppress and enthrall. He hated violence, did not want it to come to war, and so he took it upon himself in 1774, I think after getting the okay from Adams and Warren, he went to England. And his mission was, let me see if I can talk to all the Lords of Parliament and the Prime Minister, and maybe we can I can tell them in person that whatever lies that are being fed to him by Thomas Hutchinson about these unruly rebels in the colonies, all of that is exaggeration. We're more than happy to sit down and make a deal. And like many colonists, he did believe that Britain had broad constitutional power over America. He, just like other revolutionaries, wanted America to have say in how they were taxed and governed. So again, he did not want to sever all ties with Britain. He just wanted to avoid bloodshed. But unfortunately, in the diaries and the letters that you have from his trip to London, it's not a very good trip. He is talking to all of these lords, and they're all saying very pretty things to him, but it's clear that they are all set on war. Britain wants to make an example of the colonies, and they will squash us. So he realizes this too. And in early 1775, he boards a ship back to New England, and he is in low spirits. He writes to his father, he writes to his wife that war is inevitable, and he has very important information that he must deliver to the Sons of Liberty, to very vital secrets that he's keeping. But he dies. He is within sight of Cape Ann, and he dies of tuberculosis. He's 31 years old. This is, as you can imagine, a devastating blow to his family. His father is heartbroken. His father takes the memorial ring above that Josiah Quincy Jr. had bought in London with the sort of, you go to London, you get memorial rings, someone's going to need to be memorialized at some point. Didn't know it was going to be him. So his final words are engraved on the back, "Oh, save my country." The family essentially preserved his memory in amber at Quincy House. The house became a shrine to him. And this is what it looks like in the 1880s when the final occupant, Eliza Susan Quincy, is there. And she is the family's record keeper and antiquarian. And this is how it looks today. We've pretty much kept it intact. But you can see in the living room the sword that leans up against the wall, the Copley painting of Josiah Quincy Sr. above the mantle. It's an ode to this family. And Josiah Quincy Jr. is almost forgotten by everyone else. He becomes a footnote in the annals of the Revolution, and the family believes keenly that if he had lived, he would have been among the first rank of statesmen, according to Eliza Susan Quincy. He would have been known the same way you know Paul Revere or Samuel Adams, but you don't. So he is a bit of a forgotten patriot. The family takes great pains to make sure that doesn't happen. They publish his memoirs, his letters, first in 1835 and then again in about 1870s. And Eliza Susan Quincy first helps her father, author these, and then she takes control as editor. And she writes in the editor's note, the publishers didn't want to publish this, it was after the Civil War. They thought, no one cares about the lives of revolutionaries. We've just been through a civil war of our own. And she says, but I persevered, I persisted. This story had to be told. And she, made this beautiful watercolor of his grave at Quincy. She had Gilbert Stuart come in, She had Gilbert Stuart come in 1835 to paint a portrait of him based on memory only. There was no surviving portrait of him otherwise. And so, again, this is a multi-generational effort to keep the memory of this man alive, who died too young and whose life and actions were eclipsed by his fellow patriots. And then I'm going to end with the object that really sparked this entire idea for this exhibition. This is a wonderful wool quilt top, and it's unlined and it's unfinished, and it's made of red, white, blue wool squares. And it came with this note in the 1920s, and the note says, yes, this belonged to an ancestor. It was made from the discarded uniforms of dead soldiers at Bunker Hill. And the letter back to him from our founder says, oh, great, we'll keep it. Yeah, sure. I'm sure we'll dig up an ancestor who was at Bunker Hill that will verify everything you've claimed. There was really no questioning, it's the Wild West era of collecting for us. We were taking anything. And it basically remained in our textile storage, and someone cataloged it with the keyword Bunker Hill in it, and that's how I found it, because when I first started, I was just kind of doing a wild search of our collections, and I was typing in everything. Bunker Hill, Siege of Boston, Tea Party, and that's how I found this object. And I'm going through the object file, and I'm reading these letters back and forth, and even my predecessor, Richard Nylander, is like, I'm not sure, I'm expressing my skepticism, but the wool is kind of unusual. You don't normally see bed linens from the 18th century made of wool like this, and it's unlined and unfinished, so probably wasn't being used on an actual bed. And he kind of like leaves it there. He's like, okay, this is the 70s. He's like, well, we'll come back to this later. Flash forward to 2025 when I'm working on this. And so I say, okay, let's call in my team of experts, my crack team. And that includes our our conservators. It includes my friend David Wood from the Concord Museum, and a man named Joel Bowie, he works for the National Park Service, but his day job is auctioneer, but his real passion in life is historic reenactment. And he is the kind of nerd that would know the grade of wool used in British military uniforms. That's just how specialized his knowledge is. I worked with him before. I kind of knew. I was like, I got to bring you in. He's my myth buster. So he comes in and we lay this thing out on our table, and him and David and everyone's looking at it. Silence, silence, silence. And I'm half expecting him to be like, yeah, this is a fraud, this is a fake, this is nothing. But instead it turns out, it's not the kind of wool you would see in bed linens. It is actually the kind of wool you would see in military uniforms. Oh my God. But, Joel knows, he rules out right away that this is not the grade of wool you find in British military uniforms. Even the lowest ranking officers had better wool than American. So it was indeed consistent with American military uniforms, the kind used all throughout the 18th century, and that was used up until the Civil War when, the uniforms changed. So, okay, check in the box of maybe this is true. So then my next task was, okay, let me find this ancestor at Bunker Hill. And I'm tracing, I've got on my favorite website, Ancestry.com, and I'm tracing all the family tree, every single branch and twig. And I do find an ancestor who was at Bunker Hill, but he was 19 years old. And so I'm thinking, well, if you know anything about Bunker Hill, there were mass graves. It was a horrific battle, and it did not end well for either side. And so I find it increasingly dubious that an American soldier would strip his fellow patriots' jackets off their dead bodies and then bring them back to New Hampshire. What is more likely, and this is the story I'm sticking to, is that sometime in the early 19th century, veterans donated their old uniforms to a quilt maker in this small town of New Hampshire, and she put together this commemorative object that was rarely used. There were practically no insect bites, there was no wear or damage, it had been only very lightly repaired in some corners. So this thing lasted, and at some point the story went from whatever it was to, dead soldiers, Bunker Hill. And that's just the power of these myths, the family memories that become mythologies. And I thought this object perfectly encapsulated the themes and subjects of this exhibition. And you can see it for yourself when you come to see Myth and Memory at the Eustis Estate, and it's open until November 15th. Thank you. Questions.
Erica, I just wondered if you could say a little bit about the other properties that historically England is involved with, because I was trying to find how many places that you have jurisdiction over.
So we are a historic preservation organization. We own and operate 38 house museums across New England. We have houses on the North Shore, and you might recognize Beauport. In Gloucester, we have Cogswell's Grant in Essex, we have some homes in Newburyport and Salem, but we go as far north as Wiscasset, as far south as Jamestown, Rhode Island, and as far west as Stockbridge in the Berkshires. So except for in Vermont, which is the final frontier for us. We'll get there one day. But yeah, then we have, the season begins the first weekend in June. All of the houses are open that first weekend, and then they're open throughout the summer on their own separate schedules. So, yeah. Any questions? Yeah.
The Brattle Street Church, is that in Boston or Cambridge?
It's in Cambridge, but it really no longer exists. There's like.
And why would the Adams go to Cambridge?
I think it was located further down, sort of on we're still trying to figure out where it was. We know that there was a Brattle Street Church, but there are numerous accounts about where it was actually located, but we know that they were the parishioners there. Yeah.
Oh, we can repeat the question.
Yeah.
And ask. There was some trouble hearing it from the back.
Oh, about Brattle Street Church and where was it? That's still a bit of a mystery to me. I'll repeat the questions next time, so I can't be as helpful as I want. Yes, sir.
Erica, I was curious when you said the loyalists had lawsuits for reparations. Did any of those, what became of those? Did they get any money from the judges here?
Yeah, he was asking about the loyalists and whether or not any of the claims were honored. And some of them were, the vast majority were not. I mean, like I said, these were sold off at auction, and they were still considered enemies of the state. There was a committee convened to sort of inventory and distribute these confiscated goods. A lot of it just went back into the pot, though, of for the Americans. So the documentation exists, but whether or not the claims were honored or reimbursed, really hit or miss. Not many were. Yes.
Where is the Josiah Quincy Memorial?
It's in Quincy Cemetery, the Josiah Quincy Memorial. And the gentleman.
I've always been curious about something we talked all the time about currency. What was the currency back during the Revolutionary times?
It was-
I've never seen an example of a bill or anywhere.
It was paper and coin. It was pounds, shillings, and pences. It was the British system of currency, I think, until even further past towards then.
Was it printed by each state or was it?
I think there was a lot of different coinage that was circulating. It wasn't just British. I mean, there was Spanish gold also circulating in the colonies. So, you really had to, the silversmith and the goldsmiths really set the standard for what the value of gold and silver was worth. And so you were kind of relying on the merchants too to help to sort of figure out the value of things. But there were coins and there was paper currency as well. Yes.
You have been exploring so much in your, I have to say this, your short career, as an older person. But you have researched a lot of the hidden histories for historic New England and the untold stories. You did some research with the Congregational Library, I think, the association with that. What was the topic of your master's, of your PhD thesis? Because you're working now with a collection that's so vast.
Oh,
What was your specialty?
well, that's so funny because it actually brings me to Manchester by the Sea. I wrote my dissertation on the colonial revival furniture trade. I was interested in the furniture that my great-grandparents owned that was coming to me, and I had no place to put it. But I was interested in how names like Chippendale and Hepplewhite became sort of mainstream names that every American knew, and how the antiques were translated into designs that were manufactured by companies as local as the Dodge Furniture Company. And so my research took me to Manchester by the Sea about 7 or 8 years ago to research that. And so it kind of all ties together, the colonial revival period. When did Americans start to invest in colonial styles of furniture as markers or measures of distinction for their 20th century lives? I was interested in that.
There is a movement in the North Shore to save General John Glover's house in Swampscott, Massachusetts. That house was previously owned by a loyalist who was Judge Brown, and he later became governor of Bermuda. Do you have anything in your collection related to that story?
I wouldn't know offhand. We've got 125,000 objects, so if we do, it might be something you can look up on our online search catalog. Yeah.
I have to say that actually I'm on the board of that group. That house turns out, with further research, it was not owned by the Browns. That's new material, that's new information. Just throw that out in case all of you have been following that.
I will say things have come to us over the years we had at one point up to 70 houses that we ran, and over time we have deaccessioned a lot of those houses, and they have either gone back into private hands or they've become their own independent historical societies. I don't think that house is one of them, but We have in many cases kept the contents of these houses, even if the houses themselves have returned to the public domain. And so we do often find ourselves with odd or unique objects associated with houses like the one you're speaking of. So we won't know until we search, so it's not a no. I don't know yet.
Well, and that house in particular had a lot of colonial revival in it because it became a restaurant in 1957, the General Glover restaurant, but before that, it was a tea house, and she had a lot of colonial revival.
Yeah, the tea houses had all sorts of fun stuff. All right. Any other questions? Or otherwise, I'll thank you again for coming tonight.